Welcome to the third meeting in 2014 of the Rural Affairs Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public, remember to turn off your mobile phones and all these electronic devices that interfere with our sound system. Thank you. I have apologies from Cara Hilton as a member. And agenda item 1 is a decision on taking in private business that relates to approaches to various aquaculture and fisheries issues. And are we agreed that we'll discuss the approach to these in private? We are agreed. Thank you very much. We'll move on to agenda item 2, the draft third national planning framework NPF3 evidence session. It's the second agenda item today, and it's our second panel on this subject. Unfortunately, we've received a note from Scottish Land and Estates, who can't now be present because Sarah Jane Laing is not well, and we're sorry about that. But on behalf of the committee, we wish her a speedy recovery. But for those who have not been here before, the microphones are handled by the sound system, so you don't need to press any buttons. We'll go round the room, starting with John Mayhew, to introduce yourself, and everybody else round the table just to kick off. You don't need to say very much. We will ask the questions.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John Mayhew, and I'm the director of the Association for the Protection of Rural Scotland, which is a membership charity with about 500 members.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Claudia Beamish, member for South Scotland and Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr Sarah Skerratt and I'm the Director of the Rural Policy Centre at Scotland's Rural College.
Good morning, Richard Lyle, MSP, Central Region.
Phil Thomas, I'm Chairman of the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation. Scott Dalgarno, Development Plans Manager with the Highland Council.
Nigel Dawn, MSP, Angus North and Mearns.
Carroll Buxton, Director of Regional Development with Highlands and Islands Enterprise.
Alex Ferguson, MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries.
Calum, Davidson, I'm Director of Energy and Low Carbon with Highlands and Islands Enterprise.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland.
Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
Stuart Goodall, I'm with COMFOR, Representative Body for Forestry and Timber.
Graham Day, I'm the MSP for Angus South.
And I'm the convener, Rob Gibson, MSP for Caithness, Sutherland and Ross. I'm going to kick off you don't have to answer every question that comes up, but feel free to just indicate, and then I'll try and bring everybody in. So the effectiveness of NPF 1 and NPF 2, have led to, the considerations we're having now for NPF 3. As long-term spatial strategies in rural areas, how do you think things are developing when you think about the history of us trying to work out national priorities in this way and trying to hone them in for the current period? Anyone want to kick off? Oh, that's a good one. Right, Carol Buxton. Good morning.
I think we generally think it's a positive move. Certainly MPF3 trying to, it's described as the sort of spatial expression of GES, which I think is very positive, and bringing together economic development, sustainability and environmental issues together, I think is a positive and welcome move.
Does anyone want to flesh out any of the differences that there are as we've moved on through 3 phases of this kind of national overview? Yes, John Mayhew.
I think it's really important that we do have such a spatial strategy at national level, and the NPF 1 and 2 have worked pretty well overall. We have regional strategic development plans to regional level and local development plans, but there does need to be something which gives a national spatial steer to those, and that's what this seeks to do, and in general it does it well. There are tensions between some of the things that it's trying to achieve. There are tensions between government objectives. We're trying to protect the landscape and generate renewable energy. We're trying to provide housing for people and look after biodiversity, and there needs to be a way in which some of these tensions are articulated and addressed, and an overall national lead given to the priorities, and that's what it seeks to do.
We're making a start to try and work out what these priorities are so that we can report and clearly sustainability in our economy as well as looking after our natural resources is something that's got to be carefully balanced. And people have different views on that. Do you think that then NPF 3 does that better for this age than what if you were involved before? Yes, Phil Thomas, first of all, yes.
I think it has made progress, and I think overall as a high-level strategic document, it's really quite good. I think it's, if you were looking for the further developments, and this isn't a weakness necessarily in where it is now, but it's the bit that probably needs to be refined a bit more, is it's quite difficult to predict the economic elements of the development sometimes. But those elements are actually quite important in putting the rest of the flesh on the bones. So that's the bit of articulation, I think, that over time might well come up to rather more fully in subsequent documents.
What do you mean by predict the economic developments?
We have gone in Scotland, I think, quite a long way to identify increasingly key industries, key parts of the economy that you would want to see developed. And then you have the question of really how far, how quickly, and so on. And that's actually quite a challenge. We all recognise that. But that's quite fundamental if you're thinking ahead about planning issues and would build into the MPF 3. I think the present document is a good document, I have to say.
We don't need to labour the general point, but there may be things folk want to come back in there. We want to look at the way that the needs of rural communities have been taken into account, because that's our main remit in this committee, in developing the proposals. So how do you think rural communities fare in the documents that we have, since we're looking at the well-planned this and that? Who's first? Scott Dalgarno?
I'd say one observation we'd like to make about the spatial strategy in NPF 3 that's very positive is that it's the areas of coordinated action that you had previously and in the main issues report for NPF. The areas of coordinated action, everyone was clamouring to make sure their area was picked up by one of these areas of coordinated action. And I think the shift that we've seen in this proposed NPF to areas of coordinated action being separated up into the energy hubs focused on low carbon and the very clear spatial strategy with the 3 tiers of cities, rural towns and the city regions focus going down to the rural towns and the coastal hubs is a positive one, because I think it very fairly addresses the wider needs of the Scottish communities and in particular rural communities, which perhaps wasn't portrayed as well by the areas of coordinated action previously.
Other people want to comment on that? Sarah Skerratt?
I'd like to follow up on that and say that the integration that is proposed in the framework is really welcome. However, as you'll have seen from our submission, we would like further integration. And we see that in 3 broad ways. Firstly, in terms of policies and integrating the framework with other national policies, other regional expressions of policy, and particularly rural policies. Secondly, integration across geographies. And whilst, as you've seen in our paper, we do welcome the differentiation that's just been talked about by Scott, we're concerned that that might compartmentalise rural rather than looking at the synergies and how they are related and are related in practice and therefore need to be related to one another in planning context. And the third aspect of integration that we would encourage more of is between themes. So housing is talked about, and we highlight affordable housing, particularly infrastructural investment in broadband and roads, and also employment and employability. And as we know, these are so knitted in with one another, and we recognise fully the need to itemise them, but we would be concerned that that itemisation then leads to compartmentalisation.
Taking that forward, Graham Dave wants to say something.
Yeah, sort of develop this in a specific direction, if I may. How does or how could NPF 3 be made to help check the outward migration of young people from rural areas?
Yes, Skerratt.
I'll answer your question, Graham, but it was, as you noted, it was something we felt concerned about that wasn't in NPF 3. Young people aren't mentioned at all. So what we did suggest is planning the framework, taking consideration of affordable housing, which is critical to young people remaining in rural areas, business incubator units and apprenticeships associated with those very often as businesses grow, and also affordable transport, public transport, maybe integrated transport between private, community and public sector. But these three elements we felt would encourage the retention of young people alongside what's already mentioned here and in other documents to do with further and higher education provision. And we know that there are education providers who are enabling young people to stay in their rural areas rather than having to leave. But it's what happens after that, how are young people retained after that. That's admirable and critical, but what happens next? And we feel that these other elements of housing, business units and transport are essential.
Angus MacDonald, Scott, and then Carroll, and then Calum.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Given that housing has been mentioned already this morning, clearly it's a major need for rural Scotland, particularly not just affordable housing but also social housing. The panel will be aware that one of the 13 priorities for rural Scotland, as outlined in the submission, as outlined by the Rural Development Council, is an improved supply of affordable housing in the places where it's needed, using designs which are appropriate and sustainable. However, I also noted in the submission from the Association for the Protection of Rural Scotland that concerns are raised regarding, and I quote, the uncontrolled sprawl of housing and other developments in rural areas. Now, while NPF 1 and NPF 2 have clearly shared the same goal in the past, I wonder if the panel could enlighten us as to why we've seen less progress than we all, I'm sure, would have liked.
We'll try and bring the issue about migration and housing together just now, if you want to comment. So the next one is Scott. You've identified in Highland Council from the census about the question of housing development being key to many areas' success. So taking it from there.
I was hoping, if I may, to make a comment on young people in particular, on that question that was posed. By way of illustration, I wonder if I could focus on the Caithness and Sutherland area is where we're preparing a local development plan for at the moment, incidentally, is perhaps a good illustration of where the need to tackle young people and the retention of young people is particularly pronounced. And it's interesting to note from NPF 3 that Wick, Thurso and Scrabster are specifically identified as centres where centres for investment, transport hubs, servicing and places to work. That's a positive thing, because we do need to have that national framework which we can then reflect in local development plans. But if I could just make this does illustrate a wider point about the NPF as a whole, which is that it does tend to reflect more on things that are happening at the moment in local development plans. And these are issues that we're addressing through the local development plan process and we're very aware of and we're tackling head on with other agencies in the area. There is perhaps less of a focus on what might drive that forward even more than we are doing so at the moment.
I'll ask you just a little bit, because it's clear in Caithness that the lack of land in the towns of Thurso and Wick have meant that people have sought to build houses in the countryside, and that farmers have been able to sell plots, and that the population of the rural areas in Caithness has increased for those who can afford to. Well, what are we going to do about the issue of having somewhere for people to live in these hub areas? Because that's what the census shows.
There has historically been some land availability, I would say a generous supply within the towns. There has been a decision, we have seen a shift, particularly through the census, has shown that there has been a shift to outward landward areas out with the towns. And we are looking to redress that by allocating more land in the towns themselves so that you can provide for a wide choice of housing within the towns, and obviously you can concentrate servicing within those towns, reduce the need to travel and make sustainable places to live. So it's something that we're very aware of and are trying to address through the plan.
Other people can come in on these things as well. Well, Alec Ferguson first, and then we'll come to Carroll and the others, yeah?
This is on this very point, actually, and I just wonder if I could bring a South of Scotland perspective to this as well, because in my experience, one of the problems we've had is that where housing has been built in a very rural part of southwest Scotland, houses have tended to be built not so much where the identified need is, but more where the infrastructure will support the housing. And quite often these are in communities where there is not a lot of local employment opportunity. There is a very poor public transport infrastructure. And unless we sort of join up all of that thinking, we're not going to solve this problem. We might build houses, but building in the wrong places, I think, has particularly poor effect on climate change targets and that sort of thing, because you are dependent on a car to get somewhere and all of that sort of thing. So this is not just a... There's quite a problem here, and from the South of Scotland perspective as well. Is really
because we've got a large area of rural Scotland with small towns and quite big countryside areas that we're talking about in this part. But thinking about migration and housing and so on, taking on these points and means of stopping it, I think Carroll's first and then Calum.
Really building on what Sarah had said, I think, yes, in terms of retaining young people, housing, and particularly affordable housing, is incredibly important, but linked to the connectivity issues. Unless those young people that can access, or when they can access the affordable housing, also have access to opportunity, both in terms of employment or education, and the ability to get to those opportunities. I think that's the linkages between those things is vital. One without the other is not really feasible or addressing the issue. And I think in terms of connectivity, not only transport connectivity, but digital connectivity as well, which obviously is mentioned in MPF 3 too.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to have to press you on that, because, you know, even the scheme around the Highlands is only aimed at 83% of the homes.
Well, I think, well...
and businesses.
84% of premises is what we've contractually committed to.
Sorry, I got that wrong. 84%.
No. However, I think that is a starting point. I mean, I think we are committed to extend that. We're already looking at how we can extend that percentage to more premises, and also other methods of connectivity. You know, new technologies which are currently coming on stream all the time. I think obviously our aim is to get to 100%, and we have to focus on that. However, if we put it into context, without the project that's currently rolling out in the Highlands and Islands, 21% of premises would be covered. So although 84 is not, you know, it's not our ultimate aim, I think it's certainly an incredibly big leap forward from where we would be without the project.
Without a doubt, and the same in the South of Scotland scheme as well. We're agreed, but nevertheless, it's still going to be more expensive for people possibly trying to hook up to the system from the most remote rural areas. And we're talking about accessibility, because Community Broadband Scotland, which we took evidence about in our budget considerations, is a very small pot of money to advise people, but the cost of people trying to actually access that, you know, is something that's still an added problem for.
I think I would underline that Community Broadband Scotland isn't addressing that last 16% in the Highlands and Islands is not purely the remit of Community Broadband Scotland. I mean, I think our aim should be to get the main core NGB project as far as possible, which allows people to access wholesale prices on a national pricing basis.
Thanks for that, Sarah, and then Calum will get in on the point he's going to make, but Sarah first.
Rob. It was on the affordability issue, which we may return to, because broadband is one of those other essentials in terms of infrastructure for sustainability of rural Scotland. I'm part of a committee of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which is publishing its inquiry findings this spring into spreading the benefits of a digital society in Scotland. And and affordability and reliability are two key elements here in ensuring that people have what's now being seen as a right to access. It's affording rights, and therefore if you don't have this access, you don't have access to certain rights as a citizen. So it's having increased implications according to the findings of the RSE report. So it's just to flag that up, that will be being published in the spring.
Sorry, Claudia wanted to say something about this. We'll get to Calum Davidson in a minute.
All right, thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I just wonder how, in relation to the needs of rural communities, just broadening it out slightly, one of the government's 13 priorities for rural Scotland is number 9 is more community control of assets and resources. And I wonder the degree to which that's relevant in the conversation we're having about empowering our rural communities in terms of either housing or ownership of assets within towns and villages or beyond.
Well, that might well be something that Energy Man here picks up.
Carroll can touch on that. Certainly from High's viewpoint, we've been very focused on successful communities are ones that control a lot of their assets. And when you look at particularly places such as Gia, where a successful community controls its asset and then has the ability to control money generation activities, and particularly someone like Gia or Egg, we're looking at community renewable energy. And it's not renewable energy per se, it's something that gives a sustained long-term income stream that allows that community to reinvest within a whole range of other activities, whether it's energy efficiency, housing, community facilities. We do have an issue, though, in some parts of Scotland now where grid is giving us a major problem, and communities can actually not develop projects that are able to connect back to the grid. Now, at a high level, we're working right across with Scottish Government, with UK Government, with the appropriate transmission. But when you're right at the end of the wire, there can be a real problem in getting some specific communities going forward. If I can just touch on the point I was going to make earlier. Yes. I was actually going to go back to, if you're looking at what is the heart of a successful rural community is actually well-paid employment. And on the back of that, everything else kind of flows. If you've got people who are in well-paid employment, you don't get out migration, you get in-migration of young people. And I certainly like to point towards the examples from somewhere like Orkney, where over the past 10 years there's been significant population growth on the back of the testing of marine renewables, effectively the development of whole new industries. And that tied into a really interesting infrastructure of physical infrastructure in ports and harbours, but also crucially, even quite what looks like from an urban area, very small educational activities. Heriot Watt and UHI both having quite small master's programmes in somewhere like Stromness, but are churning out 20 to 30 really high quality graduates per year who are right at the heart of economic revival. So even from, if you're looking at it from somewhere like Glasgow or Edinburgh or Aberdeen with many thousands of students, a small location with high quality education can actually be an important driver of both employment opportunities and crucially getting young people back into communities. As Rob knows, my own son is now back up in Thurso studying and intends to stay there on the back of community renewable energy.
It's an interesting point. John Mayhew has wanted to come in. I mean, I look at the maps in NPF3 and there are growth points in the old Highlands and Islands Development Board terms. You're talking about an awful lot of the bits in between, and it seems to be a very different picture of Scotland.
The only point we were trying to make was very much the one that Scott was making, which is that it's best from a landscape point of view, which is our interest, but it's also best from a climate change point of view, which is with your own remit, if it's possible to focus the housing development which is required into the towns and villages. Now, I hear what you say about the lack of availability of land, and people like Highland Council are doing their best to identify that across Scotland. It's also supporting the point that Alex Ferguson was making, that it's really important that the housing development goes goes into the right place, not just for where the infrastructure can support it, but also from where it's actually needed. It's just that phrase at 224 worries us a little by saying we do not wish to see development unnecessarily constrained. If I was somebody wanting to build a one-off house in the middle of the countryside, or quite a few of them, I would find some support in that, and that might bring me into conflict with the planned approach which the local authority is trying to make to encourage development in places with public transport, places which already have schools, for example.
See, management of people we're talking about, not the actual use of our natural resources, because the natural resources are spread all over the place. And what we talk about the countryside is going to have to be a little more focused in the way that we define it, because, you know, just to say that we can't have, you know, potentially not have houses in the countryside is to go against the whole way in which people have lived in these lands for millennia. And in today's terms, the resources that we're talking about are in small places as well as larger ones, you know. So we're trying to make a balance of these things. That's why I'm trying to explore this in a bit more detail just now. Sarah Skerratt was going to say something about that.
Yeah, I was actually coming back to...
Oh, well, that's all right. Maybe very directly. Yeah, please, no, carry on.
You were talking about community control of assets, and we carried out research in 2011 on community land buyouts, and did find evidence that community ownership enhanced the resilience of communities. However, to qualify that a wee bit, not that evidence, but thinking more deeply in our response to the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill, we have said that asset ownership and a move towards asset ownership does not necessarily equate with empowerment of those communities, because those processes are very complex, and there needs to be support for governance processes and capacity building. And I know there are initiatives that run alongside Community Empowerment Scotland Bill in terms of guidance and community learning and development and so on. But we're concerned, at least in the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill, that there is this presumption of an immediate link between ownership of assets and empowerment of those communities. And there's a flavour of that comes through here in the National Planning Framework too, which we've put in our paper in terms of renewables, and the implicit link there between community benefit and a growth in renewables. And we're saying it's as we all know, much more nuanced than that. It depends on who's involved in those processes and the capacity and the of communities, the actual accrual of benefits and what's done with those, the disbursement of them and so on. So I suppose we're arguing that it's more complex. It's still navigable, it's still mappable, but it's more complex.
Other comments on that? Did you want to come back, Calum, at all? Or Carroll was... Yeah.
A general point, I think I would absolutely agree. Again, it's a case of integrating. Community ownership of assets is great, and as you say, it does very much enhance the resilience of some of our more fragile communities. But certainly in the Highlands and Islands area, we do try and align that with community capacity building programmes. We have a programme called Community Account Management, where we work with kind of anchor organisations within communities to try and ensure that there is that capacity to continue and have a sustainable future for these assets, but also bringing on more people. You do tend to find in a lot of our very rural communities, it's the same faces that are involved in everything, and we need to spread that knowledge and capacity throughout the communities.
Sarah Skerratt,
the other area we're researching is the role of the private sector in that too, in terms of working with communities, because I think certainly in the field I'm researching, rural communities are seen as everything but the private sector, whereas the private sector is integral to rural communities. And so we're very interested in exploring how the private sector works with communities. And that could be private landowners, it could be other micro-enterprises and SMEs. But I just wanted to flag up how our research is showing they're integral in this process.
No, that's helpful. It'll be a very interesting report to see. But in terms of this, the questions about how, you know, the NPF3, you know, accounts for rural communities. We're going to have to hone in some ideas there. Phil Thomas?
It's just picking up a point that Sarah has just made and Calum made earlier. The key to all this is economic development in terms of jobs and opportunities. If you don't have that, getting better local opportunities for education, for example, simply creates highways out of rural areas rather than highways in. And the element, I think, which is distinctive about rural areas is if you have industries and activities in those rural areas, very often coming in through inward investment, but activities that are tied to the rural area because in somehow they're tied to the resources, be it forestry or agriculture or fish farming or whatever it is, that makes those activities less mobile. If you simply pilot in some manufacturing activity which doesn't really fit, there's always a risk that if you have a shift in the economics, that activity then gets piloted out and you're left with a major problem. So I think the development you need in rural areas is development that's tied to the rural resources, if I can put it that way, is often on a scale that doesn't distort the rural community. And then you start tying in the education and housing and all the other bits that go with that, so you get clusters of activity in particular places. I think that's the model that we should be trying to follow.
It's one model, yes, certainly. I think we want to try and move into some of the infrastructure issues that are in this. The spatial strategy pursued in the draft NPF3, you know, considers city regions, rural areas, coasts and islands, and you know, they all share particular issues to do with flooding, waste, all these sort of issues which we've got to deal with. Jim Humes, want to kick off on that one?
Thanks very much, Convener. As the Convener rightly said, the spatial strategy is a big part of it, looking at low carbon, employment, etc. But of course it's maybe quite wise to look at flooding as well and river basin management. Obviously, river basins aren't generally coterminous with local authorities. So it'd be interesting to see all your views on where we are at the moment regarding river basin management, which for specifically for flood, and what the panel's views are on the framework's position on that. Are we seeing enough local authorities working at the moment regarding flood risk management? Is it part of planning? Is it part of the rural economy that everybody is thinking about flood risk management? Are we seeing some joint activity already, or is it something we need to work harder on?
Scott.
I fear that question's coming my direction. So I think we are adequately dealing with flooding issues. We are not only making sure they are dealt with through the planning application process, early on in the planning application process, we are dealing with them through the development plan as well. There's the SEA, the Strategic Environmental Assessment process that we go through in preparing a development plan and interrogating every decision that we might make on allocations for future development adequately addresses, I think, the potential for flood risk issues.
Maybe to think outside the Highlands and Islands Council area to other perhaps local authority areas, because we're obviously interested in the whole of Scotland. I realise you're from the Highlands and Islands, and maybe you are coterminous with your river. No. So I wasn't getting at you. I'll do that later. I just wonder if you had a view on Scotland as a whole, rather than maybe Highlands and Islands Council, which I think you're maybe applying for. Highland, yes, apologies.
Not really, not sure what to add, only that there's obviously changes coming nationally with the new potentially vulnerable areas, the PVAs that are coming out with the new mapping, and we're keen to see how that might affect future development opportunities. There is the potential that it could impinge on potential options for the future. and that's something that we need to be very acutely aware of.
Graham Day is going to...
Yeah, but perhaps to develop, I think, the point Jim's trying to make. In previous work that the committee's done looking at climate change adaptation with the National Farmers Union, there was conversations regarding the need for dialogue between local authorities and farmers with regard to what use might be, certain fields might be put to. Would they put low-value crops in now because there's every chance that in managing flood situations, those fields would have to be used for water runoff? I mean, are those sort of conversations already happening with local authorities, or do we need to put some sort of momentum into that nationally?
Certainly, it would be very useful to have a much more, a very long-term focus on that. It would, and to get a guide on that kind of issue nationally. We, as I've described already, have very clear processes for minimising any risk of flooding for the future. We are also incorporating. We're also very aware of any flood alleviation schemes that are happening. But yes, perhaps a longer-term view might be beneficial.
But we're not just dealing with new communities, we're dealing with existing ones that deal with coastal flooding as well as inland flooding from rivers as well. So, you know, how do we, you know, reflect that in our remarks about NPF3? Because it's often these older housing, older communities that Sarah Skerratt wants to build upon that are extremely vulnerable, especially the coastal ones. I'm sure that Alec Ferguson's got a similar situation, you know, not in his constituency, but with Dumfries, for example, you know.
Yeah. So rural ecologies, I mean, you're head of environment, etc. I mean, do you think it's a conversation that's starting to happen about, you know, actual users, through the chair of, obviously, actual users, land users actually taking into account river basin management further downstream, effects like that?
Very much.
Just in its infancy, perhaps? Or?
Yeah, we do have within our consulting division a specialist unit looking at environment and environmental implications of different activities, and land use activities. And they work closely with our agricultural consultants. So, as you say, it's a relatively new field. There have been environmental specialists within the organisation for a number of years, but the setting up of this specific unit recognises the growing imperative of these issues. So we are integrating those into the advice that is given to farmers and land managers and larger estates with whom we work.
Bill Thomas.
Possibly respond to this from a previous incarnation, since I was chief executive of the college for quite a long time. There has always been an issue in terms of flooding on major rivers. The Nith would be a good example, the Tay would be another good example. And very often farmers do, in effect, although they may not necessarily express it in these terms, do acknowledge that they have land close to the river that's at greater risk, and therefore they will plan around that. The bits that become difficult to manage very often are very simple things, like getting rabbit burrows in the bank of a river that weakens the bank, and then the first time you get a real spate, the bank breaches and you have real problems. And then, of course, it's a major cost to re-establish the bank and so on. And I think if there are lessons to be learned that we may not have learned well enough, but I think they're learning in the south of England now pretty quickly, is that the irritating issue of constant maintenance has a habit of coming back and biting you if you don't do it, if I can put it that way. So there is a lesson in there, I think, that farmers probably are responding to already, to be frank.
I'm from the farming community myself, and obviously, and we all often hear that they can't maintain some ditches, drains and burns. And if you look at the middle of Hoyk, there's half of the river's built up with the gravel, and I know the Hoyk Flood Risk Management Group there have been looking for that to have the gravel extracted, as was always the case. And now we're seeing this in the Somerset levels, of course. But here, I mean, according to what I hear, is SEPA keeps saying, no, no, no. I mean, is that something? Maintaining
rivers, yeah.
Yes,
what they were doing with
which
diggers
were
down
always-
in the Somerset levels, yes,
Yeah.
okay.
Is that something?
For environmental reasons, yeah.
Yep. Is that something that you recognise?
I couldn't comment specifically on SEPA's budget for this. Certainly...
The fact that people aren't being allowed to dredge, if you like, or take out gravel, as would have been the case in years. Due to, you have to have a licence to do that.
Certainly, taking out gravel is more restricted than it was. It's more controlled, if that's the way to describe it. Whereas historically, if you went back 30 or 40 years, farmers would work on riverbanks almost, on their own volition. That now is much more difficult to do. So there are restrictions, and in fact, I think if I remember correctly, there was a case just last year of a landowner actually being taken to court by SEPA for some riverbank work, which hadn't been authorised. So there are restrictions on that. And I think for a while there was a policy that SNH had, which was referred to as the Wild Rivers Policy, which was trying to encourage people to effectively allow rivers to take their course. That, I have to say, is now at least not as visible. It may still be there, but it's certainly not as visible. So there are some issues about regulation of who can do what and where.
I think it's also, as I say, it can be an urban issue as well. As I say, the centre of Hoyk, half of it's all gravelled up, but anyway, and they have continuous flooding.
There may be one or two others in relation to city regions, rural areas, coasts and islands that we want to look at in the spatial strategy, and Dick Lyle is one of them.
Thank you, Convener. Professor Phil Thomas actually slightly on it earlier, providing jobs locally in areas. The Scottish Government have a zero waste strategy. We're trying to reduce the amount of waste, but we still have a situation where waste is passing each other as they go to different parts of the country. In fact, earlier this morning I discovered we're even exporting to Wales. Should we actually have designated sites within areas? In particular, in my region, Viridor has recently opened a new glass and recycling plant in Newt Hill, just up from where I stay, and that's provided 30 jobs. Should the government go back to what I believe was, first of all, done within the Scottish Executive, designate sites where waste or recycling or even plants to generate heat. In particular, we have, and I compliment the government on designating finally Ravenscraig as a national site. In Ravenscraig, as you know, former steel plant, a lot of building going on, starting to move now thanks to the Scottish Government and the TIF programme, and basically we could have a sort of heat as we build up these plants. We could have a heat generation plant within that area, which would give to the thing, which would reduce our carbon footprint. So my question after all that is, should there be designated sites pushed by the government? The problem is NIMBY, not in my backyard. Some people wouldn't like it, but should we have designated sites that we should have where a concentrated programme in order to reduce our waste?
Waste strategy is undoubtedly something that's got a spatial dimension, and it's obviously something we've got to think about as one of the a major human activity. Anyone want to make any comments about waste? Phil Thomas.
I can comment on a specific example of that because it is an issue that the salmon industry has been, or the aquaculture industry has been in discussion with Scottish Government about, because we have encountered situations where waste has had to be tracked from sites quite long distances. In fact, for some types of waste, I think the nearest disposal site until recently was Doncaster, which is really quite a long way away. And therefore, developing a strategy that had a regional basis to it, to reduce the distances that you'd have to travel, I think is something that we have to take on board. But it is something that's in discussion already.
Calum Davidson.
In many ways, in rural Scotland, there needs to be a refocus from waste as a problem to an opportunity. I can think about the particular example up in Shetland, where very expensive to ship glass out of the island. So in fact, glass is now there's a company being set up that actually turns it into gravel and sand for the building industry. And it's that kind of low-level focus on trying to get into industry, the thought that one person's waste is another person's feedstock will have a significant impact.
I'd just like to add to that, because I really think that's a hugely important point. Just very briefly, I visited a scallop processing plant in my constituency just a couple of weeks ago. All the shells from the scallop, which used to be disposed of in this country until Super decided they shouldn't be, they're now exported to Norway, where they're ground down for use in pet food. This is just diabolical, frankly. We should be adding the value. Yes, simple as that. And with a joined-up strategy, I think we could.
Good points. Sarah Skerratt.
Of joined-up use of waste. I visited the North Harris Trust last year or the year before, and they use waste oil from restaurants to power the car that the ranger uses to go around the island. So it's another example, and they have a designated waste area as part of the North Harris Trust where they're recycling glass and waste oil and so on. So it's possible. I'm sure there are numerous examples at that local level of seeing it as an asset rather than a problem.
I think that's always been the way that we've discussed waste, but we thought in terms of the spatial strategy that it's something where rural areas might well be affected by the use of sites for processing waste in the way that we've just talked about, or indeed as transit sites. Nigel Dawn.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, everybody. I think one way that we could perhaps look at this and move the debate on is actually to think about wood, because I'm conscious that trees do grow. We could do with rather more for all sorts of reasons that people will give us. The wood that you can then get out of a sawmill is a usable and renewable source of housing, which is something that people might want to comment on. The waste wood is then a wonderful resource for burning to generate heat and maybe power. I'm just wondering whether people could comment on whether we've got any kind of strategy for wood. I know what we're looking at is a spatial strategy, but this is an enormous resource, and it is something which actually could occupy a very large amount of Scotland. It already does. I think currently 18% of Scotland's covered with wood. Yes, so it is rather important, actually.
Scott Goodall. Sorry, Stuart Goodall. I can't read.
It's okay. Thank you for teeing up that question for me so well. I much appreciate it. I'm very supportive of exploring that issue a bit further. Just very quickly, we sort of see the forestry sector as being the ultimate sustainable development sector, renewable opportunities to deliver rural employment and benefit the environment and help government achieve its carbon targets. So we're really keen to see that forestry is able to expand beyond the 18% in a sustainable way, working with other land uses. And we're in a situation where we're not delivering enough of the commercial components of forestry. Successive Scottish governments have wished to deliver 10,000 hectares of planting a year, being a mixture of productive commercial forestry and native woodland. And at the moment, well, for the last 6 or 7 years, we've not been delivering any of the commercial woodland, which is creating a problem for us in the future. You might have seen stuff in the media recently about concerns around the ability for the sector to reinvest in the future if we don't plant now. So I wanted to just put that plug in, because there's a recognition about planting, but it doesn't recognise the commercial element, and I think it's important that the commercial element is pulled out in the committee's work. So after I've done that plug, if I could come back to the specific question, we're very cautious around the use of the term waste in forestry. We had a lot of problems as passed as an industry with SEPA, who wished to licence the products from sawmills as waste, which would have resulted in additional costs and bureaucracy. It's a product which doesn't have a great value. A sawmill produces sawn timber, which is a very high value. The rest of the wood, which can be 40 to 50% of the log that goes in, has a much lower value. But what it isn't, thankfully, is a waste, which is to say that there are markets for that material, and there have been traditional markets. It goes into panel boards, so if you're producing an MDF, which may end up in a kitchen, that's one use. Animal bedding, there's all sorts of markets for it. We are seeing renewable energy now arising as a market, and that's creating competition both for the raw material as well as the co-product, as we call it, from the sawmilling process. I think the important thing for us is about how government approaches the support it provides for the renewable energy sector, because we've been very concerned that, especially at the UK government level, there have been quite simplistic support for large-scale electricity generation, which is a terribly inefficient way to use wood. Wood has energy locked up in it. If you burn it for electricity, you unlock about 40% of that latent energy. If you burn it in a combined heat and power plant and a heat source to heat a swimming pool or a local community, you can get over 90% of the latent value. So it's a crazy idea to lose over half of that through an inefficient process. So we've actually been very pleased that the Scottish Government's been very positive in working with us to say, how can we steer the energy sector towards using wood in a local scale, on a much smaller scale. So I think the main thing I would like to say to take out of this is, please don't see forestry co-products as a waste. There is a market there for them, so it's about best use of that material. And we want to make sure that we continue to support the sawmilling sector. Putting that into houses as a renewable material, high-value material, creates an awful lot of jobs and added value, a lot of carbon benefits. And where it is being used in the energy sector, it's very much at that local small scale where it can provide a complementary benefit.
Calum, Davidson.
Renewable heat is the big issue in rural areas, unlike in urban areas where you can get large district heating schemes. The best way to do that is to replace domestic oil in either businesses or in premises with biomass or wood. So I would fully support the comments.
It's interesting in the Bank of Scotland survey about farmers that the third most prevalent use of renewable resources is wood for burning. And it's interesting also that there's a crisis raised by some farmers about land being taken over for growing trees, and there seemed to me to be a disconnect here if farmers are using quite a lot of wood for burning in their premises for their businesses and so on. But Jim?
No, just to add to what Stuart Goodall's said, I've long before an MSP did some studies in Europe regarding that, and especially Austria to be specific, and there the community heating plants, smaller ones were purely about creating heat, slightly larger ones would be cogeneration, so the electricity was almost a byproduct of heating water, basically. So I concur with Stuart.
They're fascinating. I just thought I would try to keep the timber thing going just for a minute. And Alec Ferguson wants to come back. On Sunday night, I saw Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall in Sweden, and he went to IKEA where they're building complete houses, mainly from timber and other resources, so that you can patch together whole rooms, in a day, to make houses that are much cheaper than the affordable houses that we're building by conventional means. With a lot of timber that's available, is it more important to be using it for construction of that sort? We could be doing an awful lot more with our resource here, because that seems to me to be one of the ways of trying to deal with, I don't know, maybe people don't like living in little boxes, but on the other hand, they do. And these could be a good deal more climate-friendly ones as well. But, are we geared up to be able to think in those terms of using timber to such an extent? Obviously, places like Sweden have got a heck of a lot more than we do.
I can come back on that. I totally agree with you. If you're looking at the raw material that you have and saying, how can we achieve the best value from this in terms of the economy, in terms of environment, in terms of rural employment, then you would say, put it into a construction purpose. It locks up the carbon, it displaces other materials which have a huge energy input in their construction, and it provides local employment. So it gives you a big boost in those terms. I think there is, in Scotland, we're ahead of the rest of the UK in terms of acceptability of using timber, for example, in timber frame housing. But we still do encounter resistance against its use. And there are a lot of misperceptions out there as well. So, for example, if I build a house with wood, you know, the second house in the wool story was blown over by a wolf. Well, you know, that doesn't happen. You know, concerned, you know, somebody's saying, well, it's going to burst into flames at the first time somebody lights a cigarette nearby, you know, which is rubbish as well. Actually, wood burns predictably and is a far safer building material than steel, for example. So there is a lot of misperceptions, and it's just trying to get people to understand that, because in one way, Scotland is the engine house of the timber industry in the UK. We produce 50% of the timber and 50% of the sawn products. We then export that. You know, it's a nice export story if you call England an export market, you know, which we're quite happy to look at in that context. But there is more opportunity to be using it here. And we see companies, for example, over in Troon, who are creating timber frame on site as panels, which can then be erected very quickly and allow you to build very quickly and thermally efficiently, which then reduces the energy consumption of the life cycle of the property. So there's a lot there, and I think it is about encouraging developers, architects, specifiers to understand the properties of timber and work with it.
A number of points that can be raised here. Alec Ferguson and then Claudia Beamish.
I just want to get back to the biomass issue on a sort of practical point, which is, because I'm a great believer in adding value locally wherever possible. To what extent is the fuel for biomass imported at the moment, and to what extent are we self-sufficient? And are we capable of being sort of 100% self-sufficient in it?
Certainly we would expect if, for example, Scottish and Southern Energy, with their they've got consent to be building an energy plant, wood energy plant, Rosyth, in Grangemouth, I think it is. And Rosyth, yes, and they've got 4 plants which they have been looking at. The scale they're looking at, they want hundreds of thousands of tonnes of wood, and we produce in Scotland about 6-7 million tonnes of wood. So if you want somebody comes along and says, I need 500,000, 1 million tonnes of wood, then that displaces other business. So that's where we've had concerns, and what we're seeing with somebody like that is that those companies are looking to import, so from North America, for 2 reasons. One is that they require such huge volumes, it's difficult to aggregate that level of volume in one place without impacting on the existing sawmilling sector. And also because they're able to buy those in wood pellet form, which is what they're looking for, so it's ground down sawdust and then reconstituted as a pellet from places like North America very cheaply, because they don't have a ready market. So that's what we're seeing happening there, and I think it comes back to this whole point about scale. We have the opportunity to develop an awful lot more local scale wood heat, because the amount of wood that you'd use to heat a swimming pool or an old folks' home or something like that very cheaply, especially if it's off the gas grid, you know, whereas replacing oil, requires hundreds of tonnes a year, you know, as opposed to hundreds of thousands or millions of tonnes. And it really comes back about the signals and support that Scottish Government provides to say, we don't want to just let this thing develop as is, especially not being driven by, in this case, the renewables obligation, a UK-based mechanism, which is going to create real damage in terms of Scottish employment and hitting carbon targets. So we'd appeal for the Scottish Government to be very active in that.
Interesting. Good. Claudia Beamish first. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks, Convener. I'm trying to focus us back onto, from what has been, I regard as a very interesting conversation about the opportunities from what is no longer waste, but what can be used in recycling, the opportunities in wood, the opportunities in all sorts of ways. what would people from the panel, both from industry and also from council, see as any changes that there should be within the spatial strategy of National Planning Framework 3 that would facilitate these moves in rural Scotland? Are there specific things, or are they separate to, or are they there already? Are they separate to it, or are they there already, or are there new things that should be in this document in its final version?
Okay, Scott.
In response to that and the earlier point that was made about waste management in general, I'd say that it's obviously a hugely contentious issue, and but it has the potential to make the biggest shift in terms of benefits. We have 2 locations that we're currently exploring. This isn't necessarily a rural issue in particular, but we've got 2 locations that we're exploring for energy from waste, those types of facilities, which are naturally they are relabeled as incinerators, and locally they're seen as being very destructive and very bad things, and NIMBYism really takes hold. We've not been able to bring forward any of those sites. We are looking to do so through the local development plan, but having a steer from a national development would be hugely beneficial. It's something that we asked for earlier in the process, and we would really like to see that in NPF 3.
Yes, we had, first of all, Jim Hume wanted to come in.
Yes, sorry, it was really going back to some of Stuart Goodall's points regarding where we are with, I suppose we'd call it biomass. What I have seen in the continent, it was more community heating plants where it was heating water, co-generating electricity if it's slightly larger places, in communities with very, very local wood, probably using brashings and bark, etc. Would Stuart sort of think that that was maybe a direction would be more sustainable and better for Scotland rather than perhaps large-scale things that we're starting to see, where we have to import?
I mean, certainly, I think the great thing about a tree, apart from the fact that it lots of carbon provides jobs, renewable, etc., and has many uses, is that there's lots of different parts of it. So you take the sawmill, the sawmill element, the log goes there. If you've got, it's not just softwood trees as well, hardwood trees. They can provide an opportunity for renewable energy. So, and it helps to bring a lot of that woodland back into management and being cared for, which is something we're missing. So there's certainly scope to be using those, and we do want to see them being used in that local usage. I think one thing which is quite difficult for us as a society is that elsewhere in Europe there is more of an acceptance of the ideal of district heating and shared reliance on your energy source, whereas what we've seen in Scotland is where we supported the idea of district heating using biomass is that it can be quite difficult to retrofit it. But if you also look at new developments, I was described of one up near Aviemore where the developer wished to offer this, but an awful lot of the individual houses didn't want to be reliant on a shared resource, lack of confidence in that or whatever. They prefer to just stick their own energy in. So even when you're offering something which is green and cheaper, they're not making that decision.
So the community has 50 boilers at different levels of working compared to one very efficient one, yeah.
I think we'll try and take another theme just now so that we can broaden this out. The implications for rural Scotland of the proposed set of national developments and the actions in the draft action programme is my thought here at the moment. So what are the implications then for rural Scotland that you think this has? Positive, negative, whatever? Going to kick off. Phil?
I'd speak of one specific one, the Central Scotland Green Network, as it is now, I think is a major and highly innovative approach. I have to confess a sort of interest because I chaired the Central Scotland Forest Trust for about 10 years, so I have had any involvement there. But the programme as it's now envisaged goes beyond the Central Forest area. And we sometimes tend to forget there's a huge amount of rural Scotland tucked away in that area between Glasgow and Edinburgh. And historically, that area really has had very poor resources of the type that the Green Network will provide. And I think that's a programme that should be supported to the hilt, frankly.
Suggested extending that to a national green network. Would people see that as something that should be stressed further? I know that some of your evidence looks at this idea. John Mayhew?
Yes, we'd certainly support the idea of having a national ecological network which would bring together all the green places, the biodiversity corridors, the landscape resources that we have in Scotland, and capitalise on all of those in the same way that the Central Scotland Green Network has been so successfully doing. And I mean, we're delighted that the CSGN carries on being a national priority because it's a really good initiative which has done a lot of good work, and I'm sure we'll carry on doing so. Also, the long-distance cycling and walking network, delighted to see that in there. That's a very good initiative. Again, bringing together a whole lot of excellent local initiatives and identifying gaps and places where a bit of extra national support can make the difference to make it into a genuine national network, which will both generate tourism and help people's health and well-being and reduce a few car journeys, replace a few car journeys with some cycling. That's all got to be a good thing, so we'd very much support that one as well.
I know there's nobody here from the Western Isles, but I noticed that Carroll and Yale and Shear suggested with the long-distance route that Lewis and Harris were included on this map, but not the Uists and Barra. Presumably these things need to be joined up as well. Do we think that we should be making comments about that? That was raised by them in their submission in writing. But take it as read that it's a question we have to ask.
Seems a fair point. Yes, that's the environment map, the natural resilient place. I don't know why Uists and Barra haven't been involved. I've cycled through Barra and Uists myself, and it was wonderful, so I definitely support that. Okay.
That might lead us on to a question from Alec Ferguson.
Maps,
yes.
Well spotted, convener. I'm sort of ambivalent on this myself. It's an issue that's been raised with us in written evidence. Which is the fact, and I'm talking about the core area of wild land map that was produced by SNH, and was given quite a level of significance in Scottish planning policy, but has not been mentioned at all in NPF 3. I would just be interested in the views of anybody in the panel who would like to comment on that omission, whether you feel it should be included. I absolutely understand that it is not a designation and unlikely to become a designation. But nonetheless, it is obviously an issue that is strongly felt by some, and I'll be very interested in the panel's views. Those who wish to comment.
Yes, I would like to comment on that, please, convener. Yes, we do feel that that core areas of wild land map, this is the map I've got with me just in case people are unfamiliar with it, we do feel that should be included in NPF 3, not just a reference to it in Scottish planning policy, because it is a very spatial issue. It's about a map, it's about particular places that people value. We think the best place for it to be would be on this green map, the Natural Resilient Place map, which shows national parks and national scenic areas and biosphere reserves. That would be the place to put it, rather than have an additional map of wild land there. I know this is very controversial, and I also know that it's still unresolved because the Scottish Government has asked SNH to carry out an additional consultation into this issue. That's now been done, the responses are in, they've been published, but the analysis is still going on. So I'm assuming that the Scottish Government is waiting for the results of that exercise, for the advice from SNH before it decides what to do about that map. I think it goes back to the point I made earlier on, which is the National Planning Framework is the place in which some of the tensions which come between different government policies can be resolved. And I think for too long we've tried to say that we want to protect our national parks and our national scenic areas and our wild land, which is something we would certainly support. We've also tried to say we need to have more renewable energy, and that is something else which is a clear national priority. These two do come into conflict, they come into tension, and I think the Scottish Government is very much to be praised for trying to tackle that issue and saying we will not have large-scale wind farms in our national parks and our national scenic areas, and that's been broadly agreed. The issue comes down to the wild land map. Now, we think that we shouldn't have large-scale wind energy developments in those areas of wild land as well. There are others who would disagree with us, but I think this is the place where the Scottish Government has shown some leadership in resolving this issue and saying there is the appropriate balance between these different government objectives. But that issue is still very much ongoing and not resolved yet.
Yes, Graham Day, and then
Can I follow up on that specific point? I welcome your comments, because that kind of flies in the face of the evidence that you submitted, because you're talking about the spatial guidance for onshore wind being extended to cover special landscape areas, historic gardens, designed landscapes, battlefields in the settings of historic towns. There's also reference to transmission grids, and you also go on to talk about the sections on offshore renewable energy, which also indicate where there are significant landscape constraints to large-scale developments in the same spirit as the onshore wind section. So that evidence kind of suggested you were very much wanting this to go much further. You used the word balance, I think, earlier on. How would that strike the appropriate balance between the competing pressures that the government faces?
Yes. There's a continuum here between those who would really not have any areas excluded from renewable energy and organisations like ours, which would rather have more areas excluded. And yes, our members are concerned about the impacts of large-scale wind turbines on that range of issues that we've listed there, and we would very much like to see them excluded from that full list of areas. But that's the decision which the Scottish Government is going to have to take, and you're listening to views from a wide variety of sources, and it's up to you to advise the government, and it's up to the Scottish Government ultimately to decide where that balance lies. I think it's taken a good step forward in the national parks and national scenic areas. I would certainly like to see, as a minimum, the core areas of wild land excluded. In any area of public discourse, you don't get everything that you ask for, and certainly there are renewables developers who think it's gone too far already, and we think it's not gone far enough. So that's the debate which is happening.
Yeah, with respect, you're now talking about extending this to offshore renewables as well. Surely, accepting entirely that your members are entitled to take the view that they do, they also have to be responsible here and accept that there is a balance to be struck. How do we keep the lights on if we're going to exclude these things?
There are offshore renewables and there are other offshore renewables, and there are a lot of them which are genuinely offshore and virtually invisible for most of the time from most of the land. There are others, particularly the Tyree proposal, which I know isn't going ahead for the time being, and also the proposal off Isla, where they are really so close to onshore that they are effectively onshore. I mean, they're wet, they're in the water, but they are highly visible and are going to really change the character of those special landscapes on the west coast. So that was the point that we were making, that it's not just, but because the turbines are so tall, the sheer scale of them has an impact far beyond the actual footprint of the site, and so that applies to some coastal areas as well as to some inland areas. That's the point that we're making. We certainly wouldn't be arguing for no offshore renewables.
Thanks for clarifying that.
And Scott Dalgarno on this point.
I was just wishing to make a comment, which it's an issue that we raised in our comments on SPP mainly, and that is on the methodology that's been used to draw up the core areas of wild land as they stand. We have some concerns that the Highlands is obviously has the characteristic, has the features that make it suitable for renewables developments. And we are seeking clarity on the methodology used, because as it stands, there is a danger that if we are to in order to meet the Scottish Government's climate change targets, the methodology as it stands has the danger of pushing renewables developments, onshore wind developments in particular, to squeeze them towards more confined areas that are, yes, avoiding the areas of wild land, but they may also, the methodology may be covering buffer areas that aren't included at the moment, and therefore the pressure on those remaining areas becomes much more pronounced, coupled with the increased buffer around communities to 2.5 kilometres. So you may see very confined areas where future onshore wind development will be acceptable based on the current methodology. So we really need that clarity.
So the current methodology, is identifying in my view, some places I can think about that are most certainly not anything like wild land at all. I can think of areas that are not, but I can also see large areas of my 13 of the 40 proposals are in my constituency, and most of them are not in areas where there's any likelihood of major development of that sort at all. So I would like clarity as well, but I think our overall view in Scotland is that we have to know whether if wildland, as Alec Ferguson poses it, as something which is going to be identified, what's the impact on the bits next to wildland? Because it seems to me that that's where the big crisis arises, and most of the letters in the newspapers. I don't know whether Alec Ferguson wants to come back.
And so is that not the same issue that would appear to have arisen also with national parks, where you say there will be no development within a national park, and then all hell lets loose when there's development on the edge of the national park? So it's the same issue, I think, expanded to cover wild land. I would say it wasn't me that proposed the wild land, it was SNH, I think.
Sorry, I know you didn't. I wasn't even suggesting that. But it's most certainly something that we're going to have to comment on. So,
yes, indeed. Yes,
if was it about that, Claudia, and then Nigel?
Well, mine was moving on to one of the other 14 developments.
Oh, right. Well,
so
we'll
I'll wait
get through them all.
Convener, if Nigel was discussing one.
Okay, so we'll have Sarah Skerratt first of all, and then.
No, I was moving too.
All right. Well, this is combined tactics, is it? Okay, right. Well, we've dealt with wild land. So Claudia Beamish.
Right. So a connected place. But I do just want to, before I focus on the National Long Distance Cycling and Walking Network briefly in the context of rural Scotland, I would like to ask, in terms of national parks, if any of the panel have a view on whether they would have liked to have seen a new national park as one of the 14 possible developments. There has been a members' debate about it, and quite where it is, I think we may not have time, Convener, to go into this morning, but it was looking at a general view in terms of, yes, certainly timescale, as Alex Ferguson just highlighted, in a helpful intervention, but also whether it should be rural or marine or anything. I would like to know.
Interesting thought, yeah, anything. No, but Marine National Park is something which people have talked about. I don't know whether that's part of our, remit here, but it's something that's on the table, without a doubt. No takers from. Well, all right, John Mayhew, very briefly.
More words, Convener. Yes, we certainly think that there should be more national parks, and the National Planning Framework gives a special place to our 2 national parks, and quite rightly says how they're exemplars of excellent management and sustainable development and so on. And it praises them, and quite rightly so. And our argument would simply be that if they're so good, should we not have some more? And I wouldn't wish to comment on where the next one should be, but I certainly think the government should have a strategy involving all possible stakeholders to come to a national conclusion as to where that should be.
I wonder if I can just make an old comment of mine on what's going to happen to the bits in between. But anyway, Phil Thomas.
Maybe others would.
I think we'll move on now.
Fine. Yeah.
If I could express the contrary view, I think that the existing national parks have been quite successful. They haven't been without problems, but they've been quite successful. But we do have to recognise, I think, that we live in a pretty congested country. And the more constraints that you have on development, the more problems you have in generating the jobs and activities in rural areas that you need to keep people there, which to me is an important priority. And I'm always intrigued, if you go to certain areas in North America, for example, the Finger Lakes area in New York State area would be a very good example. You can be in that area and you would get a real feeling that you were in a national park, and yet there is no national park designations. All the land is privately owned land operating on a wholly kind of public access basis. And what they've managed to do there is to build in the rural development policy with the greener policy that you would think of in connection with a national park, for example. have taken people along with them. And that's the model, it seems to me, that applies, and I would apply the same model, I have to say, to the core wild land areas. I think you have to recognise that these areas become increasingly important to us as pressure on land throughout the world becomes greater and greater.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Because I understand what Phil Thomas is saying, but I would argue also that a designation of a national park could be an economic development on its own, in many regards, because I think that's been proved in the two we have. Now, I absolutely agree you cannot have virtually the whole of Scotland as a national park. Well, you could, but it would slightly destroy the point. And Scotland is a smaller country. But I think there is an argument to say that you know, there's a huge economic development potential in the creation of a national park, and it should be in Galloway. I felt I just had to get that bit in.
Claudia Beamish,
as a combined land-based and marine national park, it has huge potential.
There you go. Claudia Beamish first of all, and then Sarah Skerratt, and we'll come on to Nigel's point.
Right. Mine was actually about the national cycle network, one of the 14 developments. So I wanted to ask... yeah. Is that all right, Camina?
Oh, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, do.
I wanted to ask the panel about how this can be really relevant in rural Scotland, not that I'm in any way criticising its tourism value, which obviously will bring employment in itself, but in terms of local connectivity, how this actually relates to it. And I see that the Spokes submission, which doesn't only cover Edinburgh, but the Lothians, part of which I represent, and I'm keenly aware of plans in Dunbar and different places where there are possibilities for local cycling connecting with a national network. But Spokes is very concerned that in the MPF3 it actually says that there's very little urgency, and I won't go into the quote for matters of time, but can anyone comment, particularly from a council perspective, about plans that are going forward, or any other people who are here today?
Yeah, Carroll, Buxton.
I'll say something to give Scott a chance to collect his thoughts. I think you are right. In some of the rural areas, it is more difficult in terms to see how this could add to real improvements in local connectivity because of some of the distances. What we have done with with our, for example, out-of-town business park developments or enterprise park developments is to try and build in good connectivity with that type of development in terms of cycling and walking. I do, however, think, sort of on a anecdotal point of view, the tourism value is really quite important in some rural areas. I live in Caithness, and the number of cyclists now that, you know, we're fortunate at having one end of the Land's End to John O'Groats ways in our patch, and really the number of cycle-based tourism. You know, the numbers have increased dramatically, I feel, over the last 10 to 15 years and are likely to do more so, and there have been a number of significant developments building on that. So in terms of that aspect, I think, yes, it is important. In terms of the more local connectivity, I'm struggling, to be honest, to see how it adds a huge amount of value in a lot of places.
Was it on that same point, Sarah Skerratt, that you wanted to come in? Okay, fine. Well, Scott Dalgarno.
Just to back up what Carroll said, that it's undoubtable that the national cycling and walking network has a tourism value, and the value to local journeys, to functional day-to-day journeys, is less so. We are trying to introduce through the council, you know, walking and cycling routes, better standards for walking and cycling routes, and in that regard, a national steer would be helpful. Because we have parking standards for cycling, we have, and we have a lot of national road projects listed here. But to give us a little bit more of a steer on how we might deliver local walking and cycling networks that will help to cater for those day-to-day journeys, that has the potential to really make a difference for modal shift to more sustainable modes.
Yeah, First of all, Graham Day.
Just a brief follow-up to that. I think it's a valid point, and this is not a criticism in any way, but you've talked on a number of occasions about a steer from central government, but isn't this a two-way street? And should we not be looking for local authorities who are doing good things to actually be feeding into whatever's coming forward and informing the process? And does that happen?
Yes, and perhaps that's one way that local authorities can learn from perhaps examples of good practice where it is being done. Certainly, yeah, we'd like to. That's one way of.
So do you have that opportunity to inform the process?
Sorry, can I?
So the point I'm getting at is, you've talked about a steer coming down from local government, but clearly you're delivering on the ground. You may have some good ideas. Local authorities in different parts of the country may have much to contribute. Is there an opportunity for them to feed into that process so that the steer that's coming is actually well informed by local practice?
We currently get a steer through Hightrans, our regional transport partnership, who work very closely with Sustrans. In fact, we have an officer in place who has a dual role with Sustran and Hightrans, and they are doing very well to try and introduce much stronger focus on walking and cycling locally. So we have the opportunity that way.
Calum Davidson, I think, wanted to talk about some of this, and before we come back to Sarah Skerratt, and then Nigel has an entirely different bit to move on to as well.
Convener, I was just going to pop back to one of the earlier points and make an observation on the 14 issues here, as you raised earlier, and just touch on Aberdeen Harbour, which of course is a crucial new development in the North East. But if we're looking at a coordinated spatial plan across Scotland, as the oil industry is moving north and west, and to the other side of Scotland, we'd make an observation that we're looking at coordinated action across Scotland and perhaps investing significant sums of public money over the next 5 years in an already crowded location. If we're going to help the oil industry grow across Scotland, perhaps a focus on other ports and harbours that are nearer to the resource and perhaps not requiring such a huge investment may be relevant.
Certainly is. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. But I think that you recognise there's a change in the way in which, because in the past, obviously with hydropower, it was local. It was serving a central market. We've changed electricity round the other way in some ways because it's a lot more of it's being produced more locally. But in other energy terms, that's also altering the spatial map of Scotland. And it's recognised, I think, with hub developments, as we said earlier on. Sarah Skerratt was in another of the points in the 14.
Yeah, just to follow up very quickly on the national parks discussion. Scotland's Rural College is hosting a discussion on this topic in March on whether national parks are actually a generator of economic development. I realise the paper we'll produce from that will be out with the 60 days of your engagement on this, but we would be happy to furnish yourselves with the paper from that workshop. In terms of the national developments, number 14, the digital fibre network, I just wanted to flag up that under paragraph 5.28 you mentioned mobile networks, but I'm pretty sure it's the only point that mobile networks are actually mentioned in NPF 3, and the focus is rightly on the hard infrastructure, if you like, the digital fibre network. But as we know, access to mobile connectivity is increasingly important. So I'd want that somehow highlighted, as omission is perhaps too strong a word or negative a word, but mobile gets a mention only minutely in the NPF 3. The other point I wanted to make is in relation to the further key actions on page 45. So, Convener, I can do that, or I can wait till we've discussed the major things first.
Okay, right. We will come back to that. Yeah, make that point. And Alec Ferguson on this point, was it?
No, I have a slightly different point.
Before we Nigel's been waiting very patiently there. Absolutely. Ask him to come in.
I'm always patient, I hope. Comment about the National Cycle Network is helpful because it leads me to the point about moving people around rural communities one of which, of course, I represent. One of the things that did come out in some of the evidence was the thought that we should perhaps be expanding the railways and undoing a little bit of what Dr. Beeching did, not because we're suddenly going to build new main lines, but because some spurs along perhaps existing routes would be a very useful way of taking a lot of cars off the road. And I'm just wondering whether the panel have any thoughts about whether that's a sensible thing to be pursuing. By definition, these would be short lines in many different places, but it does seem to be that there might be a national focus on doing that, because there might be a very substantial national gain by doing so.
Okay. Anyone want to comment on extending the rail network? Carroll, Buxton.
Sorry, maybe not so much on extending, but we certainly do or have had some very good examples of making better use of the existing rail network in terms of commuter trains, particularly in our area around about the Inverness catchment area, providing more commuter services in and out of Inverness between, for example, Invergordon, Alness and Nairn. And I think there are opportunities of looking at the better use of existing infrastructure.
But should we rule out the question that Nigel suggested, thinking about, extending rail? I don't know whether you had a particular example, Nigel, Don.
Oh, well, I can always think of them. I mean, just running down, for example, from Forfar down to Dundee. I mean, in my own area, Forfar is very much a dormitory for Dundee. Perhaps Perth. I think the old railway line actually tended to go rather the Perth way, but that's not really the point. There are lots of dormitory places that could be connected without having to spend many millions or hundreds of millions on going lots of miles.
Just being equally parochial, if we took Nigel's point, I represent the neighbouring seat, were we to extend that line across from Forfar to Montrose, you would have a full circuit line around the entire county of Angus, which would have enormous benefits for both our constituents, and it would also allow people on that inland corridor to get to Aberdeen, for example, by rail. So, with a relatively little spend, if we can pitch parochially, you could, I would argue, do some good, considerable good.
The point, I think, convener, is whilst that might be interesting in Angus and it might or may not be a sensible thing to do, I suspect there are quite a lot of places around Scotland where it might be a sensible thing to do. And I'm really just looking for some input.
It's worth flagging up, why not? Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that. Alec Ferguson.
Just add to that last point, convener, by saying I think there is also potential for not just getting cars off the road, but for getting quite numbers of particular timber transport off the road by putting railheads in one or two places that would... there was a strong case to be made when the Borders rail was being argued for that it should go all the way through to Carlisle, for instance, take a lot of timber out of Borders, Kielder Forest for points south and points north. I just add that to that conversation. But the issue I wanted to raise, if I may move on to that, convener, is it's another one on which I don't have any fixed views, but again, it was something that was brought to our attention in written evidence, and it's on the subject of a proposed national development, which is that of pumped storage hydro. And that the issue that was raised with us, that despite the fact that pumped storage hydro was not put forward as a main proposed development in the main issues report, it has now become one, and the result of that being that it appears not to have been particularly well consulted on. And I just simply ask if any members of the panel feel that is something to which we should draw attention as we deliberate on our final message on this, or whether everybody's happy with it. So brief comments, really, from anybody.
Just to say that the energy storage and pump storage is by far the most efficient and effective way of storing large amounts of energy. Is absolutely critical as we move forward, particularly over the next 10 years. And particularly as we're moving to offshore wind, which is a significant resource, but does require storage.
Given the talk about pumped storage hydro, what sort of schemes are being talked about just now? Is it existing ones or new ones?
There's one that's been consented with the Scottish Government above Loch Lochy. There's another one that's been proposed above Loch Ness. And I understand there's an opportunity to retrofit some existing hydro schemes to be converted into pump storage.
Loch
Sloy, I think, is the one above Loch Lomond.
Cruachan is a site that's
existing.
I think is in the development plan.
That's why I was wondering if we could get any clarification about the Cruachan situation.
It's an extension to the existing pump storage. Yes, sorry, that's an extension
Right.
there.
Okay, that's an interesting area. Thanks very much for that. How do the proposals in the draft in PF3 integrate with the government's other key policies for rural areas? We've touched on one or two of these points, but I think this is a major bit that we need to tackle just now. How do you think what the draft says, actually deals with government priorities for rural areas and the conflicts that we've identified? For example, we've had the wildland discussion just now. The question whether national parks are economic generators. We await the report from the Rural University. Other things that might be clashes in this concept of ambition, opportunity and place? Yes, Sarah Skerratt and then Phil Thomas.
Say that it was that they were clashes, but something we point out is that the single outcome agreements and community planning partnerships are mentioned right at the beginning. They're in the overall diagram, they're in, I think, page 2 of the overarching statement, and then they're not anywhere else in the whole document. And I understand that differentiation needs to be made, different levels of visioning and so on and operating. But our concern is that the realisation and the feasibility of these elements is going to be reduced if there isn't explicit indications as to how these connections can be made, the golden thread that's referred to in other documents. So that was, I've got other points, but that was the first one.
Any Phil Thomas to throw into this pot?
The one specific area I think that concerns us about this, and the document itself, I have to say, makes a good hand of trying to balance a lot of these problems. But there is a slight problem with the underlying policies because, as we've touched on already, and you could see in a wider context, there are policy strands where there's some bits that sort of interface in a way that is not entirely clear and comfortable. And I can think of a couple I think we included in the written evidence. One is the whole area of forestry and upland agriculture, where you tend to have really a conflict for the same land area. And the second one, which we commented on, although it isn't a problem as yet, is the notion of probably developing more inshore renewable generation being in conflict with the areas that the fish farming industry would see as prime aquacultural waters, if I can use that terminology. And the bit that's missing in the equation, it seems to us, is Scotland as a policy area doesn't have a policy about food security in any way. So, more or less, that element of the policy falls through the slats. And despite the fact that we're all very exercised, and quite rightly, about the impact of climate change, both locally and globally, if you look at the food security issues, they parallel the climate change issues absolutely. And yet, at the moment, they aren't into the consciousness in quite the same way. Now, I don't think we will see a situation where we will have, in developed countries, we won't have absolute food shortages, but what we will see, a large increase in prices as time goes on. That will have impacts on people's choice and on the composition of the diet, which will affect particularly the least well-off in society, and therefore becomes a pretty central issue, I think, in terms of forward thinking. And that's an area we would identify at the moment that we think there's a gap.
Spatial policy and food security. Any further comments about that just now? Points well taken. Okay. Yes, Stuart.
Thanks. I mean, it's an interesting point. I just wanted to address one of the first examples that you put forward about conflict between agriculture and forestry in upland areas. And what I'm quite cautious about is that you have arising, issues, and they can be sparked often by conflicts less about upland land use, but I think a lot of the conflicts have been between forestry and agriculture have actually been about high-value agricultural land. And so I think there's a danger that what you can do is that government may perceive there's a problem and be looking at a policy area and think, well, let's try and address this issue out there by sweeping it into this discussion. And I think what we've been able to do with Skerratt government mediating in the past couple of years is having something called this Woodland Expansion Advisory Group process, which brought together forestry and agricultural interests as well as other stakeholders. And out of that, we've worked through how to come up with ways forward. And I think that was a better process to get people around the table and talking, rather than try and look to fix policy points like national framework and saying let's utilise that. So I would say that there's plenty of opportunity for the forestry and agriculture sector to work these things out and to address these issues, and that we should allow that sort of process to go forward rather than try and put a fixed point into something like this.
Just as a matter of interest on that point, do you think it impinges on our ability to feed ourselves by having more forestry development on hill sheep ground?
I think there's, if you decided that suddenly we'd plant all the upper, all the hill ground with trees, then yes, obviously it would. But what we're looking at is a relatively modest expansion of forestry, and a lot of the conversations that we've had with National Sheep Association, for example, with individual farmers, is that you can talk about integrated models where you have a sheep farmer with a large area of land and there may be no shelter. Lots of farmers are interested in the idea of a shelter belt. You take a shelter belt, you slightly broaden it, and suddenly it becomes a commercial scale forest, which allows you to harvest the trees, maintain that shelter belt, brings income in, and provides shelter and increases productivity on the land. And I know people within the National Sheep Association who, following the conversations we have actually put applications in to plant trees. So it flags up to me that what we were was in a situation where there was people looking at this in very sort of black and white terms. This is one thing or the other, rather than there's actually ability to have a more integrated land use. And I think part of the problem is just the way in the past that things like CAP have driven apart the ability to have that sort of discussions. So I think it just reinforces that point that by actually getting around the table and looking at these things, you can make progress.
Jim Hume and then Sarah Skerratt. Yeah.
I would concur with that, having been a past trustee for Borders Forest Trust and a hill sheep farmer as well. And I have had this discussion out with Stuart, just to put it on the record. In my area, about half the farms are actually tenanted farms. Therefore, if they plant trees, it's a problem. It belongs to the landlord. Just be interested in views to put it on the record about if you do plant trees. If you're a tenant farmer, then perhaps they could be seen as in outgoings. They could be seen as a tenant's improvement and being valued. So therefore, there's an interest for tenants to actually plant as well, as long as there's a willing landlord. I think there's a bit of work there that could be done to double the area that could suddenly be available in at least my area. I don't know the facts for tenancies and landlord owner occupiers across the whole of Scotland, but it would certainly make a huge difference if that was something that could be pursued. Just wonder if there was a view on that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Sarah Skerratt.
To flag up in terms of the land use strategy, which has its next meeting in May. So the timeliness of these discussions, and also Scotland's Rural Development Programme is currently being formulated, being put together, if you like. So these discussions in terms of potential conflicts and also how these other programmes could help deliver the national planning framework are very, very timely, because we have these, or you have these opportunities to enter into dialogue in terms of the land use strategy and the SRDP. So it's really to flag the time frame up as being very useful just now.
It is, but we seem to, have one set of guidelines and plans to have to deal with after another. Thank you very much for that point. Is there any final points just now on that in general, because we were just seeing how rural Scotland's affected by this NPF3, but bearing in mind the many other things that are actually going on at the same time. Yes, Stuart.
Thank you. I could just make a quick point, and it slightly follows on from Alex's comment earlier on about trains and extracting timber. I mean, that's something that certainly we're looking at where you've got longer distance travel. But what we do have is that there's a big harvest of timber in Scotland which is coming to market, which is allowing us to deliver this rural employment and expansion of the industry. And one of the things that arises is that there are local communities who have not been used to having timber trucks passing their houses, and they're not often seen as the most attractive or welcome developments on the local roads. So there's that necessity to be accessing the timber, and we've had some very good discussions over the years and working with local authorities and the Scottish Government on how we can come up with agreed routes and how we can ensure that timber lorries are being able to extract the timber having the least impact in terms of the roads structure themselves and on local people. And we'd be really keen that that sort of thing is recognised in this process and taken forward, because it is a quid pro quo. What we see is that the sector has been prepared to avoid certain roads and identify agreed routes to help local communities. And that increases the costs on transport, which is a particular element for the industry. But in response, we are looking for local authorities and from government to be saying, well, where we have agreed routes, then we'll maintain these routes. It becomes quite frustrating if you're going round a community adding a lot of value onto your product to find that the route is not being maintained. So I think it's important that that's taken forward and continues to take forward as a process.
The timber extraction issue is a network issue, which does fit with the kind of thoughts about a national spatial plan. So that your point is well made. I think at this stage we'll draw these discussions to a close. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for what you've said. If there are points you want to follow up by writing to us afterwards, we'd be very happy to receive these. But each of you have given us more food for thought, and even timber for thought as well. So thank you very much, everybody. We're going to finish the open session of the committee just now by clearing the gallery and the panel members. At our next meeting after the recess, on the 19th of February, the committee will hold its final NPF3 evidence session with Paul Wheelhouse, the Minister, and the committee will also consider its paper on aquaculture and fisheries as agreed earlier. So thank you very much. We'll end the formal session just now and have a short break.